Trump's action could push Earth over the brink to become like Venus, with a temperature of 250 degrees and raining sulfuric acid. This dire warning came from world-renowned physicist and author Stephen Hawking. He was talking about Donald Trump's decision to make America leave the Paris Climate Agreement, which is an agreement between nations to combat global warming. Well, the effects of this decision will not only affect the weather, but will affect most every other aspect of our lives. Climate change is a serious, challenging issue that if we don't do something about soon, the situation could become almost irreversible. First, I will talk about the definition of climate change. Second, I will talk about legislative opposition to it. And third, I will offer up some potential solutions to the problem. But first, I'd like to talk about what climate change actually is. Now, NASA, the National Aeronautic Space Administration, defines it in two ways. The first way is that it is a deviation in the norm for weather and temperature in a given city or area. And the second definition is that it is an overall change in the average temperature globally. 97% of climate scientists agree that this change is not natural and is in fact man-made. Now, it's kind of interesting to talk about the possible causes of that. Since the mid-1990s, which is right around the start of the Industrial Revolution, Americans' primary sources of energy have been coal, oil, and gas, which is not good for the environment. What these things do when we burn them is they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And what happens with that is that carbon dioxide actually gets trapped in the ozone, and so any heat that the sun pushes down onto the earth, it goes back into the ozone, it gets trapped by that CO2, and then it comes back into the atmosphere. Now what this leads to, according to Kansas State University physics professor Brett Topala, is a 2-degree change, change in the heat of the average heat of the globe. Now that doesn't sound like a whole lot. It was 36 degrees yesterday, probably about 38 degrees right now. They really don't feel too much of a change, right? But it's important to realize that the average temperature of the Ice Age is only 10 degrees colder than the average temperature right now. So 2 degrees change is actually fairly significant. So, according to the Guardian article, how long does it take for CO2 to dissolve in the atmosphere? It takes about anywhere between 20 and 200 years for CO2 in the oceans to dissolve, and about several thousand for CO2 in the atmosphere to dissolve. Now what this leads to is things like the Great Barrier Reef dying off, which is a home for marine life, and it leads to rising acidity in the oceans. So it sounds like the actual science behind climate change is settled, but why is there so much opposition to it? Well, there's a number of reasons why. According to Rolling Stone magazine, Senator Ted Cruz actually stated that liberals' vehemency on climate change is actually just a way for them to control the energy sector, the economy, and just generally every aspect of American lives. At the same time, we have the president, Donald Trump, saying that it's actually just a conspiracy by the Chinese. So there's so much opposition to it, you might be wondering why they actually feel that way. Well, it's actually easy to figure out once you realize where their money is coming from. And that money comes from two different people. According to the Nation article, lying about climate change is what makes a good Republican. That money comes from two men, David and Charles Koch, who make their money in the fossil fuel industry. So naturally, they've been throwing a whole bunch of money at these Republican senators to try and pass legislation and ideas that climate change does not actually exist, Because if they were to actually acknowledge that climate change exists and therefore do something about it, that would lead to a net lost income for their companies. So, we've discussed that climate change exists, we've discussed why there is possible opposition to it. So then, what do we do about it? What can we do about climate change? Well, according to the journal Scientific American, there are 3 things that we can do. Number 1 would be to stop burning coal, oil, and gas, which would be very difficult for Americans because so much of our metaphorical energy diet is actually centered around things like coal and oil and gas. All of our cars are powered by diesel fuel. The coal industry is a massive industry in this country. And places we have, like I just discussed, we have companies like FedEx, who are, or not FedEx, but the Koch brothers, different companies who are massive conglomerates in this country. At the same time, we could work on rebuilding our infrastructure. Now this one's a little bit trickier because it actually goes beyond just rebuilding our roads, although that wouldn't actually hurt. What it goes into is finding different ways to power our buildings, because as it stands right now, our energy capacity is at max, and so if we don't do something to actually change how we power ourselves, that is just going to negatively impact the environment in a big way. Now, the Scientific American actually acknowledges that building that concrete and mixing that concrete and using it to actually rebuild these buildings is not going to be great for the environment. However, they also discuss the fact that there are different ways that the concrete making industry is actually improving in terms of how they impact the environment and so on and things like that.